In this video, we are going to discuss about basic interview questions related to Spring Boot. And also, I would try to give you a glimpse of what interviewer thinks when such questions are thrown to a candidate. So let's start. The very first question that would be asked to the candidate is, what is Spring Boot? This question is generally asked to understand how much the candidate is familiar with the concept of Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is basically a framework provided by Spring that helps to easily create standalone production grade application. Since it is standalone and production grade, we can recommend for building of microservices in Java. It also provides you opinionated view of dependencies for simplification of build configuration. These dependencies are in the form of Spring Boot starters. Now the next question would be whether the difference between Spring Boot or Spring MVC, or in other words it could be why to use Spring Boot. So someone when asks you why use Spring Boot or Spring Boot versus Spring MVC, you can tell the advantage of using Spring Boot. So the first point would be it is easy to create standalone production grade application. It provides different starter templates for simplification of dependencies and build configuration. It has embedded server support. So in case either you can deploy to any external servlet container or use embedded server. Unlike Spring MVC, there is no requirement of XML based configurations like web.xml or spring.xml. Also, it provides you production ready features such as health checks, information of application, and other metrics through Spring Boot starter activator. So moving to the next question. So any hands-on on Spring Boot? Yes, I have worked on a Spring Boot and I have used Spring Boot to create microservices, and these microservices are based on REST architecture, so we have created REST web service. Moving to next question. Which version of Spring Boot you have worked? So you can say what version of Spring Boot you have worked. For example, I have worked on Spring Boot 1.5, I have worked on Spring Boot 2, 2.2. So I can say like I have worked on Spring Boot 2.0 or 2.0. So when the candidate tells the version of Spring Boot and the version of Spring Boot is 2 or above 2, the very next question that a good interviewer would ask would be the version of Java. So moving to the next question, what is the Java version you are working on? Let's say I am saying I am working on Java 1.8. Now I had marked this question a very important question because so if you do not have any experience in Spring Boot 2.0, you would not know that Spring Boot 2.0 minimum supported version is Java 1.8 and Maven 3.3 plus. So these two questions, like the version you are working on, the Java versions you worked on, are very important to understand how much the candidate knows the basics of the project that he is working on. Moving to the next question. Do you know latest version of Spring Boot and any major changes that come in the latest version? Now again this question is related to the past question. So when I have said that I have worked on Spring Boot 2.0, I must also know what is the latest in the market with respect to Spring Boot. So when you answer this question, it gives a very much good impression to the interviewer that candidate knows well what is the latest going on with Spring Boot. So till today date, Spring Boot latest version is 2.2 and released on October 17, 2019. So with respect to major changes, they have introduced a new tag for cloud, that is a Houston M3, and there are some changes to the Spring Boot activator also. Moving to next question. What is Spring Initializer? Or in other words, how do you generate your project structure? Generally, we generate the project structure using Spring Initializer. So Spring Initializer is basically used to quickly create project structure. We need to add dependency, select build tool like Maven or Gradle, and then we will generate the project structure. So it will give you a quick start development. Moving to next question. What is Spring Boot starter and what are the common starters that you have used in the project? Spring Boot starters are templates provided by Spring Boot that provide dependencies to the application. So they are generally bundle of many dependencies, and those dependencies are accumulated as a transitive dependencies. So the common example would be Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter parent, Spring Boot starter JPA. So in case you are creating a web-based application, you would be using Spring Boot starter web. And if you want to have interaction with database and default implementation you want to have a Hibernate, then you can use Spring Boot starter JPA. Moving to the next question. What is the default embedded server in Spring Boot? So if we have done any POC or have experience, you know that the default embedded server in Spring Boot is Tomcat. So moving to the next question. Can you tell me the default port of Tomcat in Spring Boot? And how can I change the server port, or what are the methods or ways through which I can change the server port? The default port for Tomcat is 8080. Now, when you are using application or properties, you can use server.port, and you can write in this way server.port 8081. For example, I want to change to a different server port, and using command line I can write -d server.port equal to 8081. Also, we can change the server port using Spring application class. In order to do so, I have to create an object of Spring application, and then using default properties I can pass server.port and then start the application. So here it is new Spring application, custom application.class passing as an argument, and then setting the default properties, and using collections or singleton map I am passing key value pair server.port 8081 and then calling run method. Next would be to use an embedded server configuration. So you can also customize the embedded server configuration. In order to do that, you have to implement the interface, and then you can use the configure method for that interface. Generally, the interviewer do not expect the candidate to tell all of this, because we prefer to do easily, so we can use application or properties only or use command line. So if you're going to tell all of this and interviewer has a good experience again, then further question would be the order of execution of these statements. So the order of execution would be first followed by embedded server configuration, then would be command line arguments, then properties file, and last would be Spring application class. Now we will move to the next question. My project requirement is to use another server than Tomcat. So is it possible in Spring Boot? And if possible, how can I change embedded server? Now this question definitely tells how much the candidate is good in basics of Spring Boot. So the answer would be yes, we can change default embedded server. In order to change default embedded server, we can remove the dependency of Tomcat from Spring Boot Starter Web because Spring Boot Starter Tomcat is added as transitive dependency to Spring Boot Starter Web. Once we remove the dependency of Tomcat using exclusion and exclude tag, we can add the dependency of any other embedded server like Undertow, Jetty, Netty to the pom.xml and then start the application normally. Moving to next question. I need to add some properties. So where do I do in Spring Boot? In application.properties, we can add any of the configurations in the form of key value pair. Next question. Where do you deploy your Spring Boot application? If you have end-to-end experience in development and deployment of Spring Boot application, or you know how this could be done, so you can answer this question very easily. For example, in my project, we have a cloud-based deployment. So we are using Pivotal Cloud Foundry for deployment, and Pivotal Cloud Foundry is a platform as a service and is preferred by Spring Boot. Other could be AWS deployment or to any external servlet container like Tomcat or WebLogic. Now, when you answer this question, the next question the interviewer may ask you, how do you deploy your Spring Boot? So the next question would be, how do you deploy your Spring Boot application as a jar or var? So in order to answer this question, like I have done in my previous project, we are deploying as a jar. And if I want to deploy it to any external servlet container like standalone Tomcat or WebLogic, we can deploy it as a var. Now, like I said earlier, the next question would be, I need to generate var from Spring Boot application. How can I do that? So to generate the var from Spring Boot application, you need to add packaging as a var. Now this packaging tag you can change in pom.xml because generally when you create project using Spring Initializer, default selection is jar. And second step would be provide the scope of Tomcat as provided. Even if you do not do that, it would be okay, but recommended way is to provide the scope of Tomcat as provided, because when you deploy the Spring Boot var to any external servlet container, it may happen that your embedded servlet container would interfere with your external Tomcat or external servlet container. And the last step to create the var would be extend your Spring Boot main application class with Spring Boot Servlet Initializer. Now the main point to remember here is, if you just add packaging as a var and try to generate the var using maven command, it could generate fine, but when you try to execute it, it would not be an executable var. So remember these 3 points: add packaging as a var, provide scope of Tomcat as provided, and extend your main Spring Boot application class with Spring Boot Servlet Initializer. Now moving to the next question. Have you ever used loggers in Spring Boot? Yes, we have used loggers. Now the next question would be a uncommon one, because generally we do not focus on that part. What is the default logging that Spring Boot provides? The answer would be logback. So there are different ways to implement logging. You can use log4j, you can use Java util logging, you can use Apache Commons logging, you can use logback, but the Spring Boot default logging framework is logback, and it is provided by Spring Boot Starter Web as a transitive dependency. If you answer this question, then it would be a very much good impression to the interviewer, because this question checks how much depth knowledge of basics of Spring Boot the candidate has. Moving to the next question. What are the common annotations you used in Spring Boot? You know very well that the common annotations would be @Spring Boot application and other stereotype annotations like @service, @controller, @repository, and @request mapping, get mapping, post mapping, consume, produce, path variable when you are using a REST-based architecture. And if you're using an exceptions also, you could have @exception, @controller advice. Moving to next question. What is @Spring Boot application, or what is the use of @Spring Boot application? Now this annotation @Spring Boot application consists of three annotations, that is @component scan, @enable auto configuration, and @configuration. And this annotation also marks the main class in Spring Boot from where the application would start. So the next question would be, what is @component scan? This annotation scans the class path for classes and dependencies so that all the classes that are marked as component would be auto-discovered and registered as beans in Spring applications context. Now I am again repeating so that you can understand. @component scan annotation scans the class path for classes and dependencies so that all the classes that are marked as component would be auto-discovered and registered as beans when your Spring application context would start. Moving to the next question. What is the use of @enable auto configuration, or what is meant by @enable auto configuration? @enable auto configuration provides you best opinionated configuration based on the dependencies added to the class path. So when you add dependencies to pom.xml, you are adding dependencies to the class path, and based on the scanning of the class path by @component scan, Spring Boot provides you the best configuration out of that. So this was all about the basics of interview questions related to Spring Boot that I have asked whenever I went to take interviews, because this question will give you a glimpse of how well a candidate has a basic knowledge of Spring Boot and whether he has a good hands-on on the basics of Spring Boot or not. In the next video, we will look at the advanced part or advanced question related to Spring Boot.